Shalom, friends, and the topic that I've been asked to speak on is ancient wisdom in modern times, practical Vedanta. It's a vast topic and more than I can cover. I mean, it's the amount of time to cover this vast topic is certainly not enough. But what I hope to do is present a taster, sort of a tasting platter, as you would in Diwali, give a small sweetmeat to entice you to pursue this more. The disclaimer, first of all, is that this talk is done in the spirit of service to the Guru and as part of my own unfoldment and learning in this field. And also out of gratitude to Dr. Sundeep and Dr. Ranjan, who do this work. I see it as a service to them in the work they do. Now, if there's any purpose to this talk, is to kindle in those that are not already aware of this knowledge, a flame that will help you pursue it too. And for those of you already familiar with some form of knowledge of Vedanta, it appears everywhere. It's in the Gita, it's in the Upanishads, it's in the Puranas. For those of you that are already familiar, to fuel the flame or fan the flame of this pursuit for you, that you develop more Shraddha to go into it with confidence and courage. It's as a Vedantan, I don't believe in coincidence. When I agreed to this talk, I didn't realize it was going to be on Diwali's day. So I suppose the theme for today is perfectly in keeping with that. I will start off with a bold quote by one of the greatest intellects or minds of India, Swami Ramatirtha. Very little known about him, actually. He died at a very young age. And he said, all disease is born out of ignorance of the self. It's a very bold statement. And in one statement like this, we could speak for an entire week. Because when we talk about holistic health and spiritual health, what is it ultimately? Holistic is feeling full, whole again. Paripurna, we say in Shankaracharya's books. And what is spirituality? It's the pursuit of the transcendental beyond the terrestrial. So Swami Ramatirtha in one sentence gives us the entire body of knowledge. When he says disease, he's not just talking about medical disease as we know it. It's that humanity is in a state of dis-ease and suffering. And that dis-ease is born out of an ignorance, a lack of knowledge. What is that knowledge? What is the self that we seek with a capital S? Not talking about the little ego self or the little personality. We're talking about that infinite, something we just cannot grasp. We feel familiar to it, but not knowing how to get to it, we've created a world of stress and disease and disorder. And the knowledge of Vedanta is meant to clear that ignorance and take us back to the source. Now, what is Vedanta? As has been mentioned by Dr. Ranjan, Vedanta is a knowledge system that was developed in the valleys of the Himalayas thousands of years ago by sages. In fact, you will not see an authorship to these books. And once again, what does that mean? Everything that linked to this scripture and this knowledge, we have to contemplate what it means. When there's no authorship, there's no ego. So it's knowledge for humanity by certain sages who, by their own self-work and their own experience. You see, today's scientists measure the external world, and the laboratories and tools we use measure the external world. But to these great sages, through their own sacrifice, their own composite personality became the laboratory to understand these truths. So it's a different cognitive system that conveys this knowledge. It's not how we know evidence-based medicine, etc. In the Vedas, the primeval source of the scriptures, and sage Vyasa was the one who classified them according to the Rig, Sama, Yaju, and Atharvana Vedas. And the Upanishads are the final portion of the Vedas. And they are the ones that contain the philosophy of Vedanta, you see. So the Upanishads, the final, the end part of the Vedas, and that's where we get the words Veda means knowledge, Anta means end of or culmination of. So there's a practical explanation to what Vedanta is, the end part of the Vedas in the Upanishads, but also there's a philosophical meaning. The end of knowledge, it's the knowledge knowing which everything can be known, you see. It's a pure system of knowledge. It's not aligned to any religious rituals or anything. In fact, it is the step of every religion. Every religion has rituals and there's a philosophy. If you extract the philosophy of any religion on earth, that body of knowledge, even if you don't call it Vedanta, is Vedanta. It's the laws of nature. It's the primeval knowledge. And it's such a high knowledge. The basic essence of it is they're emphasizing 4 aphorisms, or what we call Mahavakyas. And they are Pratnyanam Brahman, consciousness is Brahman, Tattvam Asi, that thou art, I am Atma Brahma, this self is Brahman, Aham Brahmasmi, I am the Brahman. So they're giving you the highest philosophy. They're giving you the goal of human life. Now, every knowledge that now comes below that is tributaries of knowledge to get us to that truth. And so you see knowledge getting watered down. That's the whole meaning behind the metaphor of the Ganges pouring through Shiva's hair and trickling down, is that knowledge is so heavy, it has to trickle down in bits to people at different levels. And in fact, in other cultures as well, if you look at the Chinese Tao Te Ching, it was written by a great philosopher, Lao Tzu. If you read the Tao Te Ching, it's very similar in its essence to the Upanishads, and it refers to that infinite concept. In his words, they call it the Tao. So just some brief sort of background on Vedanta. Now, in terms of this concept of ancient versus modern, there's a tendency, because of our post-colonial history, to look at our ancient scriptures as primitive, and we must differentiate ancient from primitive. Ancient knowledge is something that has lasted from a remote period. It's old, and it was there before, like Brahman was there before creation. This knowledge was there before everything. And because it is 10,000 years old, does not make it primitive. Ancient does not equal primitive in its essence. It came in front of or before. So it's important to understand the root of the word. See, if a man in a suit comes to meet a sage in an ochre robe or simple garb, the man in the suit feels he is modern. So what does modern mean? Existing now, to measure now. In fact, in Shakespeare's words, the word modern meant everyday or ordinary or commonplace. The modern world is commonplace world. It's a material world. And because it is technologically advanced, scientifically advanced, it does not make it more advanced in terms of knowledge, because the Upanishads and the Vedas are the highest thought the human intellect can contemplate. And I said anything that comes below that is actually more mundane, more gross. So if we change our perspective, we start having the right value for the ancient knowledge systems of India, and see and realize the applicability of it in a modern world which is suffering. We have that confidence and courage to say, hey, this knowledge is the stuff that can change the world again. And we've gone through these waves on the planet. Wherever knowledge drops and sort of base desires take over with a lack of knowledge, then civilizations collapse and there's a lot of calamity and suffering. So this knowledge has the potential, even though it is ancient, it does not have to appear in its ancient garb, but it can be infused into a modern environment in a practical way so that civilizations and individuals can thrive. And here's the testament to it. Modern scholars like Niels Bohr, who was the physicist behind electron theory and the greatest physicist in the world, in fact, their ability to conceive new science was brought about by their study of Vedas, Vedanta, through the Upanishads. Now, this is a big argument in modern times where when we discuss with Indians, even sort of liberal modern Indians will say, hey, the Vedas don't teach you physics and electron theory. That is true. You will not find a chapter on electron theory in the Vedas because the Vedas is dealing with the infinite. It's higher than electron theory. But when you study the Vedas, your intellect, your buddhi expands. And I said, it's knowledge knowing which everything is known. So a person who's a physicist will suddenly, his cognitive capability will expand to see how things connect. And that creative principle, that science will pour out of him as a new discovery, you see? So it's not that Vedas will teach you specific science, but it will expand your intellect to see that. And actually examine this. There's a book called American Veda by Philip Goldberg, and he shows the flow of Vedic knowledge to the West. And wherever it's touched on a Western scholar with a material approach to life, that scholar has expanded his view. Some of the greatest philosophers and poets like Arthur Schopenhauer and Walt Whitman, Ralph Waldo Emerson, which is the mind of America, they were all scholars of Vedas, Upanishads. Through some connection, they had read it and that expanded their view. Here's another example of Erwin Schrödinger, the man who developed or was pivotal along with Werner Heisenberg in developing quantum theory, you see. Now, quantum physics is a very abstract science. To conceive of it, you have to have a very broad intellect. But how did he get there? By studying Vedanta. This is his own quote in his own book that he's written, that Vedanta teaches that consciousness is singular, all happenings are played out in one universal consciousness, and there's no multiplicity of selves. So already modern scientists and material scientists were alluding to the Vedas and its applicability, you see, and people have lost this link in the history that this knowledge is essential in the evolution of humanity as it currently stands. And the greatest contributions to science, in fact, has been because of this contact. And there are tons of examples, the link of Ramana Maharishi and his disciples. Ramana Maharishi never left his ashram, silent sage. Thousands, millions would flock to see him sit in silence. But in that connection of people visiting him, so many returned back to their countries of origin with a higher understanding of things. In fact, the first computer, I can't remember the chap's name. He was a young boy and his parents were disciples, European people of Ramana Maharishi. And that young boy and his exposure in that space became the founder of the biggest computer company, in fact, of before Microsoft even, you see. So what I'm trying to convey is that where you see things sprout in the world, there's been some Vedantic understanding that's expanded that person's view of things. And then you see development sprout from that. And there's many examples. Maybe in another talk, we can show you a history of modern people that have been connected to Vedanta. So in terms of how we understand science today is the practical activity involving the study of the structure and behavior of the physical world, the natural world, through observation. So we use our 5 senses to measure the world. And if our senses in themselves are limited, then we create tools, very fine tools, microscopes, telescopes, measuring apparatus. But science as it stands measures everything external to consciousness. It cannot go into consciousness, you see? So in a materialistic society that's purely body identified, science will be only material and will help improve the world only to improve our material living. You see, there's a limitation there. But in that limitation, we suffer. So you see this happening around the world, that even though scientific knowledge and intelligence has increased over time, we can say that technologically we're advanced. You've got push button comforts, you press a button on an armchair, it starts massaging you. We've never had these kinds of things in the history of humanity in the past. But are people happier, healthier, and content? And if you analyze just with common sense, we don't need to do a scientific study. Everything today is there a study to prove your theory. People are depressed, dejected. There's divorce happening at big rates. People are living in debt. There's disease, drama everywhere, destruction. Well, recently we're seeing in the Middle East there's war playing out with a brutish animal violence. Why is that? You see? And we have to have this question. So intelligence does not necessarily improve human life. What we need to differentiate is intelligence from intellect. Intellect is what the Vedas refer to, all our scriptures refer to as buddhi, this thinking capacity on a broader scale, matched with higher values, thing that's missing today. And I'll make my points as I go along this talk. So we have to differentiate intellect from intelligence. Intelligence is acquired from external agencies, from books, tools, computers. It's like feeding into a computer. Even AI today, it's just going to do everything a human can do faster, but it cannot contemplate, it cannot reason. It's just doing things so fast, it seems impressive, you see. you feed info into a calculator, it gives you an output. That's intelligence. So it's derived from external sources. It's a lot of memorization. You have medical knowledge, accounting knowledge, legal knowledge. That's intelligence, you see. But the intellect is the faculty to think, to reason, to judge, to decide on the pros and cons of life, you see. All intelligence we acquire is tantamount to having gold bars on a donkey's back. And you find that in medicine today. You know, we attend meetings after meetings after meetings on evidence-based theories on this drug and that drug. And it's so exhausting. In fact, I want to remove myself from those WhatsApp groups now, because how much can you know about one molecule? And then 10 molecules, and the pharma industry trying to convince you that patients need to be on it for life. Never in the history of humanity have human beings needed to depend on so many external props to sustain human life and physiology. Brahman, God intended for this thing to maintain itself through correct relationship with the world, you see. So intelligence is increasing, but we still need 50,000 tablets to sustain human life. And the animals get it right with no problem. They eat, they drink, they procreate, and then khatam, they go back to the soil, right? Human beings need stress workshops. We need life coaches, behavior coaches, all sorts of coaches need the coaches. So intelligence, does it mean we improve? You see, you have to have that question. If anything, Vedanta, the way we speak in Vedanta and teach, is always to incite critical thinking. That's actually the goal of this talk, ultimately. So that's important. And, carrying this heavy burden of these gold bars of knowledge can wear us out thin, because you just don't find solutions to anything like that. And you'll see that race also in the West today. Everybody's rushing for a PhD in something, A PhD has no value anymore, It's learning everything about nothing, one little pathway, one little molecule, but nothing about life, you see. In fact, my guru once said to me, Doc, you can pursue the PhD, but remember, in my opinion, it stands for philosophical dunce. So you can choose. Go for PhD or stick with the Vedas, It's up to you. They never force you, ultimately. So that's just a bit on intellect versus intelligence. So this is why we need philosophy. Vedanta is philosophy. It's ultimately the study of the fundamental nature of knowledge, reality, and existence, your love of wisdom. And this Gnostic principle, this want to know, is wired into human beings. You'll see it very profoundly in children. They from a young age want to know things, isn't it? Anytime you talk to a child, mommy, why? Who? Where? Where from? You see, they all have this question, and we often stifle their curiosity, you see. But of all the species, only the human being is capable of this vertical dimension to pursue knowledge in itself. Now, what is that becomes the question. So a little bit about knowledge in a Vedantic perspective, right? The first thing is real knowledge is taken, it's not given. Today, we're very liberal in dishing out knowledge. I know when I teach my medical students, these days I have to record the slides, I have to make a PDF flyer, I got to send it beforehand, then they record the lecture, and they can listen to it after. We're giving so much on a platter. Whereas the true students, the disciple with discipline, comes seeking knowledge because he has found value in the knowledge and wants to be better at something. And that desire to want to be better through knowledge in itself helps you improve. We shouldn't be too liberal. That's why, gurus don't just go, the real gurus don't just go and give out big lectures and mass followings. They actually want to sit in one place. The highest have sat in the Himalayas, and you must make the effort to traverse the jungles and fight the snakes and tigers to get to them. And that shows you prepared for the higher truth, you see. So knowledge is taken, it is not given. There must be some self-effort. Knowledge is delivered in various ways. Direct perception, I've already mentioned, is our current evidence-based approach. You measure things, and that's your perception. You can also get knowledge through inference. So, simple example, if you see smoke in the distance, there must be fire. And you'll see the Vedic verses in the Upanishads, in the Gita, and the various Puranas. They sometimes have comparisons and inference, If you're talking about Ram, in a story, you may be trying to infer or convey some attributes of Ram, you see. And if you know the attributes of Ram, he was a stalwart, he was courageous, stuck to Dharma to the nth degree. So you can infer, if someone says, hey, this guy is like Ram, that you infer those qualities in him, you see. Comparison, Shivaji Maharaj of the state of Maharashtra was like a tiger, right? So that doesn't mean he had stripes and fangs. It means he was courageous like a tiger. You see, he had the strength of a tiger. He was resolute. So they use a lot of comparison. And tradition, very important form of teaching, which is lost in the world. You see, in Eastern cultures, the teacher is always on the top, the students at the bottom. In Western culture, the teachers at the bottom, the students are all on the top, right? There's a reverence to a teacher who has done the work, and by assessing that he has lived the philosophy himself and it's worked for him, a tradition develops around him, and you gain that knowledge then traditionally. It's also then infused into culture. So we say it's our tradition to do a thing, but that tradition is based on some substance, not some weak frivolity of the liberality of modern times where anything goes. There's an assessment that this thing worked for individuals and societies, and it's been set into a methodology that children can grow around. Diwali is part of a tradition, but even there it's being lost with the frivolity. Food, the sensory gratification become the emphasis, but the depth of this idea of knowledge over ignorance is being lost, you see. Remember, Eastern cultures divinized everything, even disease. When you have chicken pox, what do? Right? We have a prayer. Someone's getting sick at home, we're having a prayer, God has come. While the person is sick, we're praying, we're trying to understand why they've gotten sick. When the chicken pox leaves, we have a prayer, thank you for coming, you see. So everything was divinized to keep the focus on the infinite. And now we're losing the essence of those rituals, even Diwali rituals. We need to not get fanatically attached to fireworks and understand the depth of it and inculcate that in the kids especially. Other thing about knowledge is that it goes from the known to the unknown. You cannot know Brahman. It is inconceivable. It's beyond knowledge. But what we do know is the world. So this is the interesting thing about scriptural knowledge or Vedantic knowledge, is that when we say it's knowledge, it's not gaining more knowledge of a thing in the world, but studying Vedanta knowledge helps you see the world as it is, not as we like it or from our dislikes, not from a polarized point of view, if I may say. So the knowledge of Vedanta helps you negate the world, because the mind will say, when I get that car, I'll be happy. And sure, there's nothing wrong with getting the car. But the point is that on attaining the car, that fulfillment does not last. Eventually, you get neutralized to it. If the car gets scratched, you agitate it again. So if you learn the laws of Vedanta, at the end of it, what it's going to teach you is that nothing in the world will give you knowledge. Complete peace, bliss, and happiness. So that process of negation happens where you'll acquire the car without that heaviness or that feeling that I need to depend on it. And that way, when you have less desire for the thing, it takes you closer to the truth, because Brahman or the infinite knowledge is already there. So what we got to clear is the dirt that's covering it. And the dirt is desires of the mind, wrong desires, you see, or wrong assumptions. I think George Billings said the problem with humanity is not so much our ignorance as it is being certain about so many things that ain't so. So neti, not that, is the whole point of it, right? And so that's just a summary on knowledge. There's a lot more to talk about in terms of knowledge. And maybe we can take it up in a Q&A at the end. There's one more point that I would bring up on what is true knowledge at the end. So without this type of knowledge, humanity finds itself in this state. You see, a human without higher knowledge is in a state of stress. And nobody can define stress. And because we can't define it without this knowledge, we have all the wrong avenues of dealing with it. And you get these silly sort of, self-help type of things. No, stress is good for you. Put it to use. Avoid it. Where are you going to avoid it? The world is constantly changing. You have a set of fixed likes and dislikes. So you got a fixed idea of the world. You got a fluctuating world. And with this fluctuation with a fixed idea, there's going to be friction, isn't it? So you're going to be constantly stressed. Whereas Vedanta teaches you practically see the world as it is. Another word for world is change, actually. Dunya, the world fluxes. So what Vedanta teaches you is to ride the waves, to flux with it, to see it as it is. While you constantly, like Indian classical music, there's a bass shruti, that bass frequency. And on top of that, the ragas are played. So similarly, the base consciousness you have to be linked to is that infinite Brahman. Your thoughts are in that consciousness, and you ride the waves of the raga, and that way you enjoy the leela of life, literally. But not knowing that, it's a very stressed life then, you see. And children are talking about stress in school. And I mentioned earlier, no other species has stress workshops, right? So money, work, family, everything, study, career, everything has become stressed. There's no human on earth that is not stressed, actually. So how do we understand stress in a Vedantic practical perspective? Well, if you take this example of a 4-foot spring, right, in its original state, and you press it down to 1 foot, that is a state of stress. There's pain and there's pressure on the hand, and it cannot exist in that state for too long. It's going to consume energy and lead to pain and destruction or something. If you release that spring to 2 feet, there's less pressure, less pain. To 3 feet, less pressure, less pain. When you come to 4 foot, there's no energy being expended, there's no pain, there's no pressure. So I put it to you, what leads to that state of no pain, no pressure, stress-freeness, right? It's not just not pressing on it, no forces applied. It's that the spring has returned to its original state, right? When the spring is in its original state, there is no pressure. When the human is in its original state, there'll be no stress. So the question we should be asking as a species, if I am in stress, then what is my original nature and how do I achieve it? And what is the force that is constricting me into the state of stress? Stress is a constriction to a narrow point. So it's almost like something vast and infinite. You feel that there's a vastness in you. What is that infinity? And how did it get constricted into this limited personality? You see, and how do I undo that? This has to be the question, our species. Because if you deal with stress just at the body level, then you're going to have a limited approach of, oh, if my wife speaks to me nicely, then I'll be less stressed. If the boss gives me a raise, I'll be less stressed. It will never work. It's all external. It's an internal thing. So stress, defined by Swami Partha is a mental agitation created by unfulfilled desires. And this is where Vedic philosophy deals a lot with at the practical level. It is the knowledge system that gives us definitions of the mind, of desires, of buddhi, the intellect. And it also tells us about the human body, but it gives it its right value. It doesn't overemphasize the body. The body needs to be taken care of, but the work to do is on this desire. So you got to control the desires and get rid of them to unveil that true original nature is the guidance of the gurus. And although it has to be done with difficulty, what is poison now or difficult now becomes nectar later. So if life is stressful, then we got to understand what is life. And life, we know, is anubhava dharana, a series of experiences. And if you take one unit of experience, it is you, the subject, the composite human personality, body, mind, intellect, which is meeting the world. You are listening to this talk, so the object is the talk and me, and you are the subject. So the subject meets object, and there's this scintillating experience of life. So that experience can be positive or negative. So it can depend on the object, the world. If you're caught in a cage with a tiger, the experience is going to be bad, right? But I would put to you, for our general living, the object, the world, is in quite a good state. It's improved scientifically with technology and everything. I've shown you that. But the point is, the subject remains unrehabilitated, you see. So if the experience of life is not that great, it's stressful, then perhaps we need to look more at the subject, you, the human being, me, the human being, and see what it is in us that is leading to a negative experience of life. So to do that, we need some understanding of the human composite personality. Now, we are told that the human has 3 equipments. You got this physical body with its organs of perception, where you can sense the world through the five senses. That sensory experience lands in the mind, which is the feeler, the emotional personality. And this is where all the desires rest, manas. So it's sharir, body, manas, mind, where all the past patterns and likes and dislikes are. And then you got the intellect, which is not known of in today's times, you see. And the intellect is that part which can manage the mind. Now, animals have a rudimentary, very small or no intellect, body, mind, so they're impulsive, you see. So they feel like eating, they eat. When they're full, they stop. It's all mind driven. Now, the human being, without using the intellect, the mind goes all over. It's a monkey mind, you see. So it needs that regulation. And scriptural knowledge develops the intellect by questioning everything and never taking anything at face value. The development of the buddhi is the important part of life. And the gross intellect can manage the mind. So that sensory experience that comes through the sense organs lands on the mind, and the mind has a reaction. And that reaction can become our action in the world. So action is determined by either a mental impulse, can do it impulsively through feeling, or it can be monitored, supervised by the intellect. And if you've got a very well-developed intellect with all the Vedantic principles, then you won't allow the mind to make decisions that are against Dharma, you see. Otherwise, it's an impulsive life which leads us to disaster. So the gross intellect, meaning that which can manage the material plane through the mind and its senses, can manage your life better. And development of Vedantic knowledge in you will help you relatively and absolutely. So even if you get some of this knowledge, you can be a better businessman, a better doctor, you'll be successful with your family, you'll have relative peace and productivity. But if you really go through it, then the subtle intellect becomes active. And that subtle intellect, see, the gross intellect monitors the world, duality, tall and short, pain and sorrow, joy and sorrow, black and white. But the subtle intellect contemplates or discriminates between the terrestrial and the transcendental. Okay, this is the world, but there's the infinite. That's what makes you spiritual. And the more the subtle intellect becomes clear and available, the more your thoughts rest in reality. And eventually the subtle intellect sort of, if you can stay on the periphery of that thought, that's meditation, om silence, and eventually, self-realization is that merging into the self. So you see, this chart is showing you that composite human personality, but it's also showing you that preceding the composite human personality is that background or the self, Brahman, Atman, God. That is essentially what you are. But through some ignorance, which we cannot understand, in fact, the masters say, we cannot ask where, whence, and whereforth this ignorance came from, because those are concepts of time, part of this illusory world. Where Brahman is concerned, there is no time. Through that ignorance, these vasanas, this fragrance of this particular pattern of desires has emerged. So every human has their own pattern of fragrance of desires, and you got to work with that to develop your intellect, to manage the mind and the body towards higher truth. Now, vasanas is a vast subject. Actually, we cannot know vasanas, and perhaps something to be taken up at another time. But just to give you the overall view, that the goal is not the body, the goal is not the mind, the goal is not also the intellect, but to use the intellect to reduce the desires. And once the desires are gone, body, mind, intellect merge into the infinite self. Vedanta also tells us that this composite human personality that we are, you see, we're so used to this waking state, we think this is everything, right? So currently, I am talking to you in the waking state. I, Sundeep Ruder, the waking personality, I'm talking to you. But every night when we go to sleep, there is a dream. And in the dream, there's a new personality, right? Dr. Sundeep Jyot may not be Sundeep Jyot. He may be an Olympic athlete in the dream, right? So if I had to come into that dream and say, Sundeep, you're not an Olympic athlete and your name is not James and you don't have a gold medal, you're actually Sundeep Jyot lying in the bed sleeping, and this dream is a fabrication of your mind. you will try and kick me out of the dream. You say, you're talking nonsense. I am an athlete. This is my kingdom. I have a palace. I have 10 gold medals. I have, a race to go to next week. And I was born on this day. I went to that school. See, the dream is only 3 minutes long. But if we had to have this hypothetically conversation in the dream, you will assert the dream as real, right? But only when you wake up, suddenly you have knowledge of your waking personality. I am Sundeep Jot, you see, right? And everything in the dream you have no value for anymore. It's just gone. You don't want to go back to the dream. You don't need those gold medals. You're happy here. You're interested in sound therapy and your music and all of that. That's your life now. So similarly, the masters are saying to us, from this waking state, this cross-seeming world where I can knock on my computer and where I'm talking to you, they're trying to give us this message that there's one final state, the fourth state, which is called Turiya. Turiya means the fourth, which you have to attain. This is the goal of your life. And Vedantic knowledge is Sapna Simhavat. It's the dream lion. It tries to wake you up from this fourth state, you see. And that's the idea. If you use the waker dreamer analogy, they're trying to convey to you that even from this waking state, you can wake up into this infinite God mind, so to speak. And from there, there's no coming back to birth and death and the cycle of suffering, you see. So they use these masterful analogies to convey these concepts to us, which we cannot understand. The waker will only understand self-realization when he wakes up in the fourth state. And that's the self-realized guru. That's where Ram was, that's where Krishna was, that's where Jesus was, that's where Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was. That's what they reached. And we can't understand that state, you see. And then, of course, there's the deep sleeper state, which is a relative bliss. You see, in the deep sleep state, dreamless, the mind is unconscious, inactive, intellect is inactive. So you feel this blank vastness, but there's still an observer there, because when you wake up, you say, I had a deep sleep. You see, so the deep sleep state is not a self-realized state. The vasanas, the potential for expression of desires, is still there. You haven't gotten rid of them. So deep sleep, dream state, waking state is the highest manifestation of all our vasanas, completely apparent. And from the waking state, you have the opportunity to work on the desires and get rid of them to get to fourth state. Now, I know this is very subtle and abstruse concept. I'm just, like I said, giving you a little burfi taster of it. And this needs to be pursued more long term, all right? And it's very important to contemplate it. Now, I'll quickly go through this because I want to get to the more practical part of it. Otherwise, I will run out of time. So this is another way of conveying it. You see, Turiya is this fourth state, and it's here. But actually, it's not a separate state. You know, a diagram is a limitation. It's the underlying state which is all pervasive. And we don't know it. You can't say, I know what God is. And then through ignorance of this infinite state, these vasanas, these unmanifest desires, that's in deep sleep. It's the causal body, you see. And as those vasanas sublimate, like camphor, when you put a flame on it, sublimates into a scent. The sublimation of our vasanas leads to your particular mind and intellect and the expression of the body. So this is your pranayama kosha, your breath and physiology. This is the body. And these are your 5 senses and organs of action interacting with the objects and beings of the world. You see that? So what Vedanta is saying, we can use this intellect, buddhi, to manage the mind and reel it in to contemplate this infinite self here, this way. Whereas without the intellect and not practicing this, applying this knowledge, you are caught in this cycle of acquisition, enjoyment, interacting with beings, which is the limited, finite, material life, which is full of suffering, you see? And if you keep going here, you just repeat cycles of birth and death to reduce desires ultimately, you see? So this is the experience of the waking state. The dream state is just the mind with some dreams. We say vomit of the day, the thoughts of the day. Deep sleep is everything has just gone to rest and shut down, but the potential is there. And this is on the brim of Brahman, the infinite. But only through going through this and working in the waking state can you get to the infinite Turiya ultimately. And then, you know, practically speaking, Om, the universal sound, is not owned by Indians and Hinduism. It's the primal sound. A represents the waking state. It's a guttural sound that comes from here. U represents the dream state. And where the lips close, is the deep sleep, that silence. So when we're chanting Om, we must monitor our consciousness being conditioned by those three states and try and tune into the silence underlying. Where does sound come from? It has to rest on silence. You see, all this pluralistic world rests on something, an unchanging screen. That is the infinite Brahman. So ultimately, the Om is that one syllable. It has an alphabetical meaning, A-U-M, is the waking, dream, and deep sleep state, and the silence it's resting on. And you can go into the frequency of the sound, all of that. But there's an intonational value as well. When you hear the chant that it's perfection, it inculcates a feeling in you, that frequency of something higher as well. You know, they say even animals' ears stand up and stand still when the great masters used to chant, you know. So Om is the sound, which is subtlest, which is on the periphery of the infinite self and the pluralistic world. In fact, it's the subtlest idol, because idols are used in the East to represent the ideal, which is God. So we have gross idols, which are earth, the Shiva Lingam, the Murtis, the statues. Then you have water as an idol, the next element. We use it in offerings, and Christians use it in baptism. Then you have fire, the first element that can be seen. And that is universal in all religions. Every time you see a flame or a lamp, it kindles a thought of higher. And then there's air. You can feel it on your skin. Being in nature and all of that inculcates a sense higher. But sound is subtle. It's related to space, the subtlest element, you see. So those five elements are linked to these type of idols we worship. And for the high seeker, the chant Om and some knowledge that you deliver through sound is more than enough to inculcate that sense. So there's a lot in this slide. I mean, we can talk about it for days, but I'm just giving some practical sense on how to look at it. And while I'm showing you just one unit here, remember, there is one human unit. Actually, you got to see the infinity, because the Brahman, the self, is infinite. It's all pervading. And every human, every life form is one of those units. So actually, as you merge into this understanding, you start seeing the common divinity that shapes our end. That's the whole point. Vasudeva Kutumbam. We are one family, enlivened by the self. If you identify with the body, you see differentiation. You see that. We see friction. We see separation. But the more we identify with the inner aspects, you see that one unifying principle. And this knowledge is so needed in the world right now, when you see all the factions and fighting and all of that stuff happening, right? In terms of a little bit of practical stuff in the last, I don't know how much time I have, about 20 minutes, half an hour. Here, a man musing on objects. This is from Bhagavad Gita, chapter 2, verse 62. It's going to the mind a bit. A man musing on objects develops attachment for them. From attachment arises desire. From desire arises anger. So now I'm zooming into, I gave you a broad view, but I'm zooming into this mind. The mind is the monkey mind, the devil between us and God, right? It's not a judgment. It's an analysis of the nature of the mind. The monkey mind needs to be reeled in. So how does the mind work? This is a verse that when you practically look at it, looks something like this. From our original vasanas, we get thoughts. From a very early age, we ought to be reducing the thoughts and desires. But what happens through life without intellect and Vedic knowledge or Vedanta knowledge or scriptural knowledge and development of critical thinking, the thoughts run amok. So you start thinking about objects, right? And as your thoughts flow towards the object, a flow of thoughts becomes a desire. A desire then becomes an attachment. I like that car. I want to have it. So attachment then leads to a want for enjoyment, acquisition and enjoyment, isn't it? And if you can't get that object of desire, or that desire is interrupted because the object is broken or got it scratched or has aged, your desires are interrupted, then you are in a state of stress. Stress is a mental agitation due to unfulfilled desires. When you're in a state of stress, you don't have inner peace, which is connecting you to the infinite. The agitations, the desires cloud your connection with the infinity, you see? And all our actions then are determined by those desires if they are not discriminate. So people will buy cars in debt, houses in debt, because they want instant gratification. Living in debt is very contrary to Vedic philosophy. Got to live within your means. That's some practical guidance, you see. So then if these desires are indiscriminate, say you acquire the object that you desire, right? What happens? The minute you acquire it, you may want more. You develop greed. The minute you have more, you don't want to lose it, right? So you become stingy and miserly, right? You become fearful, right? The minute you, not getting what you want, you're angry, right? You can also develop envy. If you see people having more than you, then you're envious. And to those that have less than you develop arrogance, pride, isn't it? So at the end, all of these negative tendencies of the mind are just modifications of desire, right? Lust is indiscriminate sensuality, where the mind goes towards physical gratification without examination of its purpose, its true intent, isn't it? And when we're angry, we get deluded and we lose our memory. It's said in the Bhagavad Gita. And that's where all our decisions become calamitous. Kama, Krodha, Lobha, Moha, Mada, Matsarya. You see? So practically, it is all modifications of desire. Now, at the mind level, we zoom in more closely. There's these reactions then happening constantly if they are unmonitored by the intellect. You see, we are constantly being exposed to sensory inputs through our organs of sensation, eyes, ears, nose, skin, and tongue. And today's world amplifies that sensory input. Advertising, marketing, eat this. You go to the West, there's so much advertising for sense gratification. It's overwhelming. So without intellect or knowledge, anyone going to a Western country is going to get consumed by that consumerism type of approach, isn't it? And we need that intellect to manage. In fact, if you go to Eastern countries, ultimately, right? If you look at the old architecture and structure, you'll never see neon signs for clubs and pubs. You see temples. You see great architectural marvels that incite sense of the higher. So everything in those societies was designed that the senses keep thinking of the higher. You go to Cambodia, you go to China, you go to Japan, beautiful architecture. And even in Europe, the old cathedrals like Notre Dame and the Sacré-Cœur in Paris were meant to incite. But the further west you go, it becomes material. So I'm not judging the West. I'm just analyzing these patterns. That if we are to, as doctors, be part of policies in healthcare, that, even at the policy level, how we design society in terms of its architecture, etc., is very important if you understand this concept from a Vedantic point of view. The kids are exposed to social media today. The receipt is just going on creating new reactions. So their output is what then that is extreme liberalism. I can be anything. We're seeing it in America now. People are identifying as animals and chairs and tables, and teachers are being told to let them be. But the purpose and purport of a human is to get to the original nature, which is self-realization. You see, now we're going the other way without intellect or buddhi. So development of the intellect is once again important here, and that's what Vedanta does. I think the slide is very practically useful for us, and perhaps in future talks we can discuss this in more detail. And then it's also important to know that the mind, and this you will not find in any other knowledge system. It's the contribution of Vedanta on concept of the mind in terms of its mental temperaments. So the mental temperament, the mind, based on your vasanas, of three types. Now, no human is an absolute of all three, of one of the three. We are proportions of this. You see, animals have a collective vasana. All tigers are carnivores. All sheep are vegetarians. They have a meek nature. Tigers are ferocious. So collectively, they have the same temperament. But human beings, even though we are one species, each individual has a different mental temperament. And knowing this helps us assess it in ourselves. And the aim of the game is to work through tamas, rise into rajas through unselfish activity, actually, and then gain sattvic properties and then go trans-sattvic, beyond sattva. That's the goal of life. Tamas is indolence, indifference, and it's most active at 6 p.m. afterwards at night. 6 to 6, we are very active, and this is the modern world, a combination of tamas and rajas today, you see. But sattva is equanimity, sereneness, poise, objectivity, which is brought about by intellectual guidance of the mind towards higher values. And the aim of the game is to capitalize on sattva, which is most active between 4 and 6 in the morning, which is why in Vedanta we say all intellectual work, jnana yoga, should be done between these hours every day. And it then fuels or enhances your, what do you call it? Your sadhana. And the knowledge becomes available during the day. I'll talk a little bit about how we can help with rajas. So rajas is frenzied activity, and people have to act if you have a lot of desires in life. You can't tell a person not to act if they have a lot of desires. You send him to a cave in the Himalayas to meditate, the active person at the mind level will end up doing business in the Himalayas and opening shops for all the sages there, you know. So if you understand how the mind's temperament is, the sattvic mindset can become an introvert and study, but the rajasic mindset needs to exhaust desires through action. But the problem in the world today is all action is selfish. My career, my name, my fame, my money, my family. That's it. Whereas in the past, action was about being unselfish, to sacrifice, to give. How can my work contribute to this community, to these people? You know, and in it you will earn. There's nothing wrong with earning. You will be taken care of. But the primary goal is not earning. You see, action in itself is not bad, but we pollute it at the mental level with selfish desire, where the ego says, I want to get something out of it. So Vedanta teaches that we should move from selfish action to unselfish action. And unselfish action is the definition of karma yoga. That's it. See, action and karma, action with the unselfish. So today's action is selfish. Karma yoga is nothing but the same action with the unselfish intent. Selfless action is the highest state. That's the Krishna state, the Rama state. You see, Krishna was a lover, a politician, a friend, a nephew, a son. He did so many things, but there were no prefixes and suffixes to his actions, motiveless, like a nightingale singing a song on a tree. It's not doing it to entertain the human sitting under the tree. It's not doing it to gain a compliment from the human. It does what's in its nature. At the human level, we have the capacity to sacrifice. And a human who is sacrificing is actually in his full form, is a selfless action. Karyam karma karoti ha. You know, that's the Bhagavad Gita saying. Do your duty. That's it. So no motives. And then the mind can be selfish, you see, and wherever we are selfish, not sacrificial, we are going to be stressed. Because the minute we limit ourselves to that ego, I want something out of it, right? You create more desires for yourself. The world must cater to you, you see? And then that's the problem. Because the world, Krishna says, is not for the non-sacrificer. How then the other, O best of Kurus? So Krishna says this to Arjuna on the battlefield. You know, he's talking to him very politely and saying, man, you have to sacrifice in life, right? You see, no other animal is capable of sacrifice. If you put a plate of food amongst 10 dogs, they fight for that food. You put one plate among 10 hungry humans, the human has the capacity to say, you first, right? But a human without buddhi becomes a sophisticated savage. We fight for that plate. Corruption you see in our countries today is nothing but the highest form of selfishness. Me first, then everyone else. It's brutish. It's animal in its nature, you see. So Dharma or Vedantic knowledge helps from a young age to show what you can achieve as a true human capacity through sacrifice. So that's a bit on the mind and the practical aspects of the mind. So how do we solve the problem? This is the last part of my talk, about a few slides to go. The point here is that without reason and logic, which is that intellect, life is like this. Thou art fled to brutish beasts. And Shakespeare identified all of these problems. You can see it very clearly in his plays. But he didn't have the solutions. If we had given him Vedanta, he would have written great scriptures, I think, as well, right? So this is what we need to do. We need to develop the intellect. Intellect is buddhi. And in chapter 2 of the Bhagavad Gita, verse 63, Krishna says, buddhi nashat pranasyati. From loss of intellect, the human perishes. You see, it's very clear. So without the intellect, what happens? The individual mind loses sanity, becomes destructive, restless, turbulent, obstinate, wrong choices. And collectively, the entire humanity suffers. Herd instinct, attachment and desires, egos and complexes you see amongst world leaders now, effect on success and peace. I highlighted religion because it's very topical in the world today. The very word religion comes from Latin. Re means again. Legion comes from ligand, which means to join. So religion actually means join again. You see that? It is the modern word for the ancient Sanskrit word yoga. Yoga means to join. You see, union with. So religion in its essence is conveying the same truth as this ancient wisdom. But the problem is today, religion has two parts, rituals and philosophy. And people have become fanatically attached to the rituals and a personality and forgotten the philosophy, you see, and that leads to all the warfare we are seeing today. So if we have correct definitions for things, practical, ancient wisdom again in modern times, then if you say it like this out in public, if you ask anyone what is religion, the Islamist will say it's going to mosque 5 times a day. It is, celebrating Eid. The Christian will say, revering the cross and going to church on a Sunday. That is not religion. Those are rituals. India knows rituals. We've got more rituals than anybody on the planet, millions of them. But what was it for? It's to cater to different minds to get to this highest truth ultimately. So you see, ancient wisdom with modern practical understanding in a scientific logic can be useful in solving the problems today. And I think that's the purport of Vedanta in today's times, that it will not look how it did during the time of the Mahabharata or the time of the Ramayana. But in today's times, Vedanta can look more logical, more practical as I'm presenting it here. And perhaps that's the way it needs to go. So intellectual development is the solution. Vedanta helps us do that. The intellect conceives of a more mature state of existence. So how do you develop the intellect? Is question everything and take nothing for granted. It's not a malicious questioning. It's a questioning with, is that so? When you say that eating this, drinking this 1 liter cold drink will give me happiness and make me look good and give me energy, is that so? Simple, practical things, you see. Start there. Go from the known to the unknown. And to aid the development of the intellect, we were given this prescription of the 3 yogas, right? The path of action, the path of devotion, and the path of knowledge. The path of action is for the body. The Rajasic person can exhaust those actions through the body, but Karma Yoga is in service, unselfish. Bhakti Yoga is for the mind, a sense of devotion through music, sound, learning the values of great characters and rishis and sages. That's why we have such a great relationship with characters like Rama and Krishna. The beautiful traits become infused into our homes and our society, isn't it? So that's bhakti, the devotion, the softening of the mind, and improving the quality of the mind in terms of talking about attitudes of kindness, charity, benevolence in our homes, in our culture, rather than talking about competition and getting ahead and fighting and, how much money are you going to make? Very negative. Jnana Yoga is for the intellect, and this is majority for the sattvic, the introvert. So you can proportion this 20%, 30%, 50%, whatever it is, according to your self-assessment of your personality chart, you see. And then you start living your life having proportioned these aspects. And as you go, your desires drop and you become inwardly withdrawn. And that person lives in the world but not affected by the world. That person's focus becomes clearer and he can concentrate. Eventually, as the mind's reduced a lot of desires, then you are capable of single-pointed thought. And actually, that's when we can meditate. We mustn't put the cart before the horse. Western people are sending apps on every device now on how to meditate. But the source of the science of meditation, which is India, I haven't seen a single app come out of India on meditation. You see? So we got to understand what true meditation is. Meditation is not a practice. It's an effect of some self-work over time. So through offloading desires, through unselfish action, devotion, which is love for the higher, and practices which increases that feeling of virtue and beauty and benevolence, either through music, poetry, art, nature, historical figures, And by study of Vedanta, that's what I do a lot of because I'm inclined that way. Jnana Yoga, you can live a higher dharmic life and hopefully in this lifetime and lifetimes to come, achieve that ultimate goal of self-realization. Now, just studying about desires is not helpful on its own. We got to infuse that with, I've already mentioned the type of action, but a direction. If you're all over the place, we see people today wanting a career in corporate, plus being a mom of 3 children, plus being a good wife, plus being on a volunteer group and a charity, and you want to cater to the extended family and the family. You can't have everything on your plate. You've got to see what your nature is, choose a couple things, and see how you can use your nature to offload the desires. This idea of multitasking is a problem in the world. I think we must have more direction. It's not to say you mustn't do or there's wrongs and rights, but assess your life and do it in a direction. Objectivity is to see things as they are, not as we like them. And then while it is my right to eat sugar, it's also my duty to take care of my body. So sometimes you compromise rights for a higher duty. I'm giving a simple example, and we can do that individually. You can do it for the family, you can do it for your community and your country. In fact, you can do it for the whole world, compromise your rights. And that's the highest masters have done that. Have this attitude of giving, not taking. It doesn't mean you must give everything away, but having that attitude of you first. It's okay. You have this piece of bread, I'll wait. That attitude, and gratitude, not a constant fake thank you for everything, but the fact that nothing I am doing right now would have been possible without so many things contributing to it culminating. Dr. Jyot has organized this, but the sun has risen this morning. That's why we do Gayatri Mantra. Thank you, sun, for coming. Evening, we do Gayatri Mantra again. Thank you, sun, for going, because even if it doesn't go, we finished. So everything works in perfection. And the human living with that cognizance has a gratitude. I understand. I'm just a spoke in the wheel, you see. And ultimately, that type of human will evolve, will reach self-realization. But if each individual does it and it pervades everywhere, Vasudeva Kutumam, then you see that changing humanity as such. So those are the higher values. And as you progress, you develop a greater identification beyond yourself, finally up to all entire living beings, the cosmos. And once you're at that level, the next step is infinity. There was never plurality. There was never diversity. We are just one and the same, that infinite Brahman. So identification with the higher. With this type of practical approach, we develop a horizontal view of life. Each line represents a colorful representation of individuals, which is wonderful. That's the rainbow of life that we see. But the higher human is aware of that infinity. And that human doesn't say, I lost or I gained. When someone passes on, you don't say, I lost my mother or father. A human has passed. You see the cosmic play playing out. And that leads to greater detachment, greater objectivity. So it's nice to see life in perspective this way. So in my final parts here, I'm not here to promote anything, but I think this point is very important. I've seeked for almost 20 years looking for something logical. And the Upanishads are the ultimate scripture. But for us that are caught in the Kali Yuga of this material world where we've not been brought up in societies that infuse. In Satya Yuga, everybody knew these truths. It was easy to talk. We have to learn the alphabet before we can form words and sentences, isn't it? For us, for myself, to go and learn Sanskrit, go through the Upanishads and tease all this information out would take 10 lifetimes again, you see. So what I found in Swami Parthasarathe's work is he had spent his entire life putting everything in a practical logic in the way you would learn the alphabet. Now, I'm not saying that everyone should be fanatic and just take this book, but my point is all of you here are in the spiritual field to some degree. But having this book as a accompaniment, as a base, has helped me understand so much more. If we can learn the definitions, the sequences, the practical approaches in this book, which he has distilled for us into one compendium, then when we go and read the Gita, when we're doing sound therapy, or when you're reading the Bible, suddenly everything comes alive. You will understand better, you see. And I think this has been the missing link, because there have been so many commentaries from modern sages and everything, but they sometimes give an angle which is polarized, their version of things. Whereas this book contains the pure objective science of these practical theories. What is karma yoga? What is bhakti yoga? What is jnana yoga? What is body, mind, intellect? You see? And once you got those definitions very clear, I think anything else you do will be wonderful. People often ask me when I speak to Christian folk, are you Christian? You know the Bible better than me. I said, actually, I've only read it once or twice, and that two parts of it. But because of this book, the minute you tell me the words of Christ, I can understand to some degree what he is saying, and you can convey it better. So to each his own. Follow your religion, follow your rituals, but get the SEP, the philosophy, right. And I would encourage you to look at this book. You know, just as the Upanishads and the Gita were in their times, the Bible and the Quran in their times were not as well known in their times, but thousands of years later, they've become the compendium. My sense is that this book, Vedanta treatise, in decades to come, will be that reference point for the modern age in a practical logic and philosophy. And I think Swami Ramatirtha predicted that this would be the case. He just never got to finishing the compendium because he died at the age of 33. And I think Swami Parthasarathy took up that torch. So finally, to summarize, we are not this food sheath, the body. We are not the pranayama breathing sheath. We are not the mind and its desires. We're not even the intellect, but we've got to use the intellect to manage the mind. When the mind is settled, the physiology of the body is taken care of. Sure, that's the physical health. We should take care of the body to pursue our higher truths. But once this whole thing is settled, what we actually want to merge into is that kingdom of heaven within, which Christ spoke about. Come to me, Krishna said, capital M. That me is within, that infinity. And as we get beyond the sheets, the koshas, the vestiges, the layers, we merge into that infinity. That ancient kosha wheel, another last point, in a practical modern way, was conveyed by Leonardo da Vinci. I meditated on this picture since I was in high school. I could not figure what was so enchanting about it. And only recently I realized it's Leonardo da Vinci's depiction of the kosha wheel. The physical limited body with its flesh and bone is in a limited square. A square is a limited structure with four corners, and its physiology is housing within it. See, if I put more corners on the square, it becomes a hexagon, isn't it? Right? And if I put even more corners, it becomes a more elaborate hexagon. And if I put infinite corners on a square, it becomes a circle, isn't it? So the limited square, the physical body, and it's actually a contradiction, is housing an infinite principle within. That's what I saw in this art. And our job is to negate the body. I'm not the body, I'm not the mind, I'm not the intellect, I'm that infinite self within. And through a practical approach of study of knowledge, governing the mind, we can get to that final state of self-realization. I'll end off with this last slide by a quote by Swami Ramatirtha. I find this very powerful. He wrote this in the late 1800s, early 1900s, over 100 years ago. What is practical Vedanta in modern times? Pushing, marching labor, and no stagnant indolence. Enjoyment of work, karma yoga, as against tedious drudgery. Peace of mind and no suspicions, no canker of suspicion. Organization and not disaggregation. Appropriate reform and no conservative custom. Getting over rituals without thinking. Solid real feeling against flowery talk. The poetry of facts as against speculative fiction. The logic of events as against the authority of departed authors. And living realization. As a householder, you can be a seeker. You don't have to go sit in a cave. You can be a businessman, a lawyer, a doctor. Bring this practical Vedanta into your homes, into your own lives. Living realization and no more dead quotations. This is what constitutes practical Vedanta. With that, I wish you an enlightening Diwali and appreciate your time this morning. Thank you very much.